Don, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start with your career, where you came from and all your experience on the Hill and what you've been doing since then?
Yeah, I thought it was a good question. How did I get to where I ended up? Because I didn't plan on being where I ended up for 28 years, and that's working in the Congress. I'm from Illinois, Freeport, Illinois, small town of about 26,000. All my childhood, even, I wanted to be a newscaster for radio and then later television. And so my whole career plan going through, high school, undergrad school, graduate school, was to be a journalist and eventually end up in broadcasting. But that took a turn when I entered grad school, and I was talking to a undergrad from my hometown. I said, "What'd you do last summer?" And she said, "Well, I was an intern for our Congressman, John Anderson." I said, "What's an intern?" I hadn't even heard of the term. So she explained it to me, and I said, that sounds pretty cool. So I actually applied for an internship with him for that summer between my 2 years of grad school, and also with the Voice of America, and surprisingly got accepted to both. I had to make a decision. So even though Voice of America was broadcasting, I had to learn more about politics, and I had switched from journalism to political science in grad school because I needed more grounding anyway. So I accepted the invitation then to work as an intern with John Anderson. He had me covering a joint committee on the Organization of Congress in '65 that summer. And so I took notes and gave him summaries. And meantime, I was writing a chapter for a book for him for the Republicans were putting out towards, I think it was called Towards a More Modern Congress, whatever. But Don Rumsfeld was the head of that reform group in Congress, in the House. And so I worked on that. Went back to grad school, still had my eyes focused on going into journalism eventually. Did the Peace Corps for 2 years in East Africa as a teacher in a high school, an English teacher. Came back to Illinois and was interviewing with a TV station. And they had looked at my resume and so on. In the middle of this interview of this TV station in Rockford, Illinois, one of the newsmen came with a right off the wire. John Anderson was just elected Republican conference chairman in the House, number 3 job. So a little light bulb went on. I went down to the Western Union station and fired off a telegram. I said, "Congratulations, I'm available for staff position, await reply." I don't recommend that people do that kind of a chutzpah when they apply for a job, but he called me a few days later, and we had corresponded while I was overseas and so on. He knew the work I did. "Be glad to have you on my staff. I'll be out in Rockford in a couple of days. Why don't you come over and we'll talk salary and so on." So I said, fine. And I still had my eyes focused, though, on going into journalism eventually. But 2 years on the Hill, and then I'll find a job in broadcasting somewhere. But he got me hooked because he was reform minded, and I had continued to work on things with him on the Rules Committee on various reform areas, such as broadcasting the House of Representatives and so on. And so basically, that's how I ended up working for Congress, and that was the end of my broadcast career, even though that was what I had wanted from childhood, but I have no regrets. Looking back, I'm so glad that, I ended up working on the inside with one of the leaders in Congress, and it went from there to working with, Trent Lott for about 8 years after 12 years with Anderson, and then Lynn Martin for 2 years. She succeeded him in that seat in Illinois. And then Jerry Solomon, my last 6 years, the last two of which were in the majority. So really got to be staff director of the Rules Committee and was still working on a lot of reform proposals for our party that ended up being adopted when the contract with America was adopted in 1995. They got a reform plank that we had been working on for years, building up various reform proposals. So, that's how basically I kept that whole thing alive while working on other things with the Rules Committee as well.
And so what have you done since your time on the Hill?
Well, I left the Hill in January of '97 after just 2 years in the majority, but I knew I wanted to try something else before I burned out. And Solomon understood, although he tried to get me to stay for 2 more years. I said, "No, you'll know when the time is right to move on." And he actually did move on two years later to start his own lobby firm. But I wanted to write a book and do some more work on Congress from the outside. So I went down to the Woodrow Wilson Center, started writing on my first book, but also started something called the Congress Project, which I directed, which brought in a member of each party it's about every 2 months. It's not something you do every week or every month even. A member of each party in the House, and a journalist that covers the Hill, and a scholar that does research and writes about it. So we call this the Congress Project, and we'd look at not just so much the specific policy areas as the background to them, the processes, the politics, the procedures that were involved in working on major legislation. So I did that from about 1998 through about 2012, and then they discontinued the U.S. Studies, where I was part of it, kept me on as a fellow, and so I went to work with the Bipartisan Policy Center on their Congressional Reform Commission, but stayed with the Wilson Center and began working on my second book, which came out in 2018. But they were both basically on how Congress changes over time.
And I'm curious about your Africa experience. So it was clearly just a couple of years, but at that time it must have been a quite interesting moment to be there. Is it Ethiopia you were in?
No, I was in Tanzania.
Tanzania, sorry, the other side of Kenya. Yeah.
Coincidentally, our new director at the Wilson Center, Mark Green, who had been a member of Congress from Wisconsin long after I had left the Hill, but he had served as ambassador to Tanzania after he left the Hill, also head of AID and head of the McCain Institute, so on. So now he's director, but I haven't had a chance to meet him yet or test his Swahili. But in any event, I was an English teacher in a secondary school there, and all the kids had English since grade school. So it wasn't teaching English as a foreign language. We were teaching literature. So I had a combination of books, novels, and poems that were written by Africans, as well as English books. We did Shakespeare and other famous English writers. But it was quite a good experience teaching juniors and seniors in high school, basically about English and the literature in particular.
Excellent. Well, why don't we move on to some of your work, or thought at least, related to the rules side of things in Congress. We've talked about rules with other guests in the past, and would like to get your perspective on, because you've spent a long period of time on the Hill, and would like to understand, sort of your view of rules and how they've evolved since when you started, and what ways do you think they should evolve?
Yeah, I think quite often it's not a planned thing by Congress that the major reform efforts are in reaction to something. Quite often, it's a major scandal, ethics scandal, or even in reaction to the imperial presidency, the growth of that, and how Congress would try to reset the balance between the branches. And so the great thing about the Rules Committee is we not only put out the special rules for other bills to set the amendment process and so on for other bills, but we have original jurisdiction on reforming the House's internal rules and procedures, the processes, and so on. So what I tended to work on were those major reform efforts, whether it was broadcasting the House in the 70s, or with Lynn Martin later on, a bipartisan task force on ethics reform that was a House task force that basically ended up rewriting not only the House Ethics Code, but the government-wide Ethics Act. And it also got rid of paid honoraria and gave members and executive branch people a pay raise in return for getting rid of paid honoraria. But those are the kinds of things where, you're reacting to sometimes a scandal, sometimes the imperial presidency. We went through the Budget Reform Act in response to Nixon's impoundment of funds. We did the War Powers Resolution in response to the overreach of the executive, going back certainly to Johnson, if not before Lyndon Johnson. But how will Congress play a role here, where they've got a major constitutional duty, whether it's in war powers or power of the purse, or you name it? Budget reform was another big one, but certainly, you're looking at things from different angles as you try and right the balance between the branches, but also put things right in your own house, where the public has lost more and more faith in the institution.
So, I understand the motivation of changing rules to strengthen Congress, in response to, moves by the executive, for instance. But can you talk more about the coordinating Congress internally, that sort of keeping your own house in order concept when it comes to the rules. So, you've mentioned crises as being motivators for changing those rules. What kinds of crises? Is it more like, obviously people talk about the concentration of power in the, in the leader, in the speaker, what have you. What kinds of things motivate internal rule changes, not in response to executive moves?
Well, certainly a big one was whether or not Congress should televise its floor sessions, its debates. I mean, those weren't even carried by audio. And we had in the 70 Reorganization Act authorized committees to begin televising their hearings and markups, which Rayburn had basically prohibited when he was speaker, because he saw what a circus those things sometimes turned out to be, especially with the old House Un-Americans Activities Committee. So, they took a major step in 70 with authorizing committees to televise. And then in 79, we did the same with the House floor after a lot of back and forth between Tip O'Neill and John Anderson on the Rules Committee and Bernie Sisk, who was a Democrat. But Anderson and Sisk wanted a network pool to broadcast the House floor. O'Neill said, no way, I want the House to control the cameras. And by golly, he won out in that fight after several months back and forth. But we eventually did get then a House owned and controlled and operated television system. But that's what people can see now, gavel to gavel on C-SPAN. But so that was one instance where I think we felt that the more the people knew about the Congress, then the more that they would understand it and somehow that they would come to support it more. Well, it hasn't necessarily turned out that way, because sometimes the more you see, the less you like some things. And so I think, that's part of it. The news media obviously pick up on the sensational parts. And so you see a lot of the conflict and not much of the parts where the Congress is able to agree on things. And, that carries over in committees too, where you see a lot of fighting between the parties. So, this is one thing that we've had to struggle with as we went along. Yes, we want more and more transparency for Congress, for the people to see what's going on. But, at the same time, how do we keep that from affecting the quality of the legislative product that we're putting out? I mean, are we sort of tainting that by allowing for too much transparency? And so that's something I continue to grapple with.
Yeah, I totally agree. And where that transparency is, whether it's committee versus the floor, versus private conversations, in the hallways, right?
Exactly.
What about rules when it comes to committee functioning? This is one question that's come up. There are many different committees in the House and Senate, and they have their own chairman, each committee, but each committee runs under certain rules. What have you thought about in relation to rules within committees? Has that changed over time? And is there a sweet spot of rules that marks a good committee?
I think the rules and committees have stabilized pretty much, but it's just that they're not being followed as much because the leadership has taken over increasing control of the legislative process. So right now, you've got a large number of bills. I won't open the table now, that are brought to the floor. We're talking major bills that have not been reported by a committee. Barbara Sinclair called this committee bypass, but it's where the leadership decides, well, this is urgent enough. We don't have time for the committees to hold hearings or markups or whatever. So they bypass the committees and bring the bills directly to the floor. But, as I say, I think the committees have fairly good rules, but to the extent to which the leadership is more and more dictating the legislative process, then you are seeing less and less opportunity for individual committee members to participate, whether they're majority or minority members. And they're feeling that. I think I kept close track, not writing down or recording all the statements that members make when they retire, but what's the biggest frustration, or what's the biggest reason that you are leaving the Congress? And they don't just say, well, I want to enjoy my golden years, I want to travel the country or the world with my wife and kids, but it's that I am frustrated that I'm not able to make any kind of contribution to the policy process now. And they will be the first to admit that it's because that the committees mean less and less as the leadership takes over more and more of dictating not only the schedule, the priorities of legislation, but quite often the details of legislation, and that's very frustrating for committee members.
And the way that the leadership does that is through rules, right? They do it through
Exactly.
Introducing legislation on the floor and then controlling what kinds of debate or amendment can happen on that legislation.
Exactly. It used to be in the Rules Committee where we had a major bill that was coming up, and I'm looking back now at the 1960s and 70s and so on. It was a major bill. You'd have 3 hours of general debate, and then you'd have a wide open amendment process. Well, that changed over time so that now, even if it's a major bill, you get 1 hour of general debate. You will have either no amendments allowed on the floor, that's called a closed rule, or a structured rule where you will have only a handful of amendments that were submitted to the Rules Committee that are actually made in order. So this week, for instance, you've got 3 bills up on the floor, one dealing with DC statehood, 2 others that are dealing with the matters of immigration and the border problems that we're having. All 3 of those bills are coming to the floor this week under a closed amendment process. No amendments can be offered whatsoever. The only thing that's adopted in that rule is the committee's amendment in the nature of a substitute in each case, but members are just prohibited completely from offering amendments on the floor. And for the last 3 Congresses, we've had no open rules, no open amendment processes, and that's because the majority thinks the minority will only use that to use poison pill amendments on the floor, and so they are barring any open amendment rules over the last 3 Congresses.
Right. And so that comes to the question of what's the substance of those amendments, right? Are they actually amendments or are they something else? Are they a message? Are they, the leadership wants to shut them down for a reason. Is that reason because of messaging or is it because of substance?
I think it's messaging. The leadership wants to stay on message with what they're trying to do in that legislation. And the extent to which you allow amendments that will undermine that message, then you're going to get the leadership objecting to making those kind of amendments in order. So, for instance, it's not unusual if the Rules Committee said, well, we're going to have a structured rule. Those that want to offer amendments will submit them to the Rules Committee by Friday. Next Monday or Tuesday, we'll take up the bill for a markup on the rule, decide what amendments to be made in order. Maybe out of that 50 amendments, which could be split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, you'll get maybe 10 amendments made in order, 8 by the Democrats and 2 by the Republicans. So, the leadership has a hand in deciding which amendments will be allowed on the floor. They consult very closely with the chairman and the staff director of the Rules Committee in deciding which amendments to allow and which amendments not to allow.
And so when the leadership does this, I'm curious, what kind of expertise are they drawing on? Is it their own organization or are they asking the committee chairs? What information is what organization is actually forming these decisions? Because it couldn't be the leader themselves making all such decisions.
No, the leadership certainly does consult with the chairman of committee, and they will, at least through the staff meetings prior to the leadership making a decision, we'll decide, all right, what amendments were offered in committee that were rejected that might still be allowed on the floor that were considered legitimate by the chairman or by the leadership. And so there is that kind of consultation going on, but otherwise you don't have certainly the type of expertise in the leadership on every policy issue that comes up. So quite often the decisions are made more by the communications people on the leadership staff especially, but also the communications staff on committees go through a similar process. What is the message we want to deliver, and how do we best deliver that, and how do we keep that message from being undermined? So, it's an intricate process, but I think you will find that there's not a great deal of policy expertise across the board on the leadership's part, but that's why they keep amendments to a minimum so they don't have to confuse things further.
Yeah, and so in theory, you'd have a lower quality of policy if you have less expertise.
Yeah, I think so. You're not
bear on the bills
force that you would ordinarily have in a deliberative process, and so that's why in my my book on the changing cultures in Congress, I indicate that over the last 5 decades, 50 years or so, Congress has slowly evolved from a culture of legislating to a culture of campaigning. And what that means is that Now everybody is focused on the next election and what bills, what messages are going to come in, be the most important in that next election. So the culture of campaigning has taken over, but that shuts out, the whole deliberative process where you should have back and forth, you should have compromise, but it's not unusual now to have votes that are split right down the middle on important, special rules, certainly, but then also on the bills and amendments that are offered as well. So things have become much more polarized because of the culture of campaigning, and there's just no middle ground now between the parties, or very little of it.
And so in your world of rules, after what you've observed, you think if you could recommend some kind of change, would it be towards more open rules, more amendments?
Yeah, I think open rules have gone the way of the dodo, and I understand that, but certainly more structured rules with more debate time on the important ones, because now if you do have a structured rule, basically the rule closes down debate after 10 minutes, 5 minutes for the amendment, 5 minutes against. Whereas, in the olden days, at least, when you had more open process, you would let that debate go on until members are ready to vote. And then, somebody would call for a vote and they would bring it to a vote. But, I think that's one thing that can be done, at least, is to allow for more general debate on bills so that the policy issues are better aired, and then also more debate on amendments that are of importance.
Right. Let's move on to the budget, the authorizations and appropriations process. I know you've talked on this subject in the past, and you've seen it over a long period of time when it comes to, in particular, the budget side of things. Can you talk about your perspective on that process and what they were trying to do, in the early stages, and how that's broken down, and if there's any way you see forward to improve it?
Yeah, we were very proud of the fact that as a result of some work by select committees and joint task forces and everything else, by 1974, we came up with a budget process to really counter the executive branch. President Nixon had been impounding funds. What that means is Congress appropriates the funds, and the president decided, well, he didn't like certain appropriations that were being made for certain programs, so he would impound those funds. Well, Congress, first of all, was focusing on the impoundment process and trying to make sure that Congress could more easily override the president if he impounded funds. But then, things came about that they realized that to make this more balanced or have a better grasp on the budget, we need a budget reform process as well as an impoundment control. And so that's why the 74 Act is called the 1974 Budget Reform and Impoundment Control Act, where Congress was trying to address both its own initiatives in the budget process as well as reacting to what the president was doing. But over time now, that has broken down. Mainly, again, I think it's a culture of campaigning. Things have become much more polarized, and so the budget committee is not acting as it used to, where you would have more bipartisan compromises on budget resolutions, for instance. And so now the budget committee has not even met the last 3 times they've brought a budget resolution to the floor. They bypassed the committee, and mainly to do reconciliation. And that's another process that's been perverted, because originally that was built into the budget process to help reduce the deficit. Now it's being used to increase the deficit, whether it's tax cuts the Republicans want or spending cuts the Democrats want. The reconciliation process is used that way. And the way they do that is they have a budget resolution that's not been reported by the budget committee brought up, so that you can have instructions in that for the various committees of jurisdiction to come forward with their actual legislation that will implement those spending increases or tax cuts, as is now the case. So that whole process has been perverted as well.
And when it comes to like this, initial step of the budget before it goes to, the committees, how has that part changed over time? And is there a way forward you think that could be revitalized?
Yeah, I think the original idea was, the budget resolution does break down the whole process into what are called functional categories, and that is crosswalked by the staff experts at the Congressional Budget Office to show how those functional categories would affect various committees in their jurisdiction and their plans for spending. So that was at least a good idea of setting priorities overall before the committees then could work within those parameters. But the committees resisted that really from the outset, but they didn't like to be crosswalked by the Congressional Budget Office. But they would go along with the overall parameters because that's just the way it came down. If the House and Senate adopted a budget resolution, well, then you had to proceed using those guidelines. But as I say, those things have broken down. So committees get very little guidance now from the Budget Committee of the CBO. The CBO basically does cost estimates on bills. If Education and Labor wants to do a bill on elementary and secondary, well, then they will put out their authorization draft, and the CBO will come up with a cost estimate as to how much that would cost. But other than that, they're not doing some of the other things that were supposed to be part of the whole crosswalk experience in setting priorities.